three kind of changes. One, the financing models itself. The other one is the technologies that follow the financing models. Yeah, like to talk about artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, autonomous systems. Then we talked about autonomous systems. Then we also talk about what is called as generative adversarial networks. Then the third trend, we talk about privacy enhancing computation. So at the technology side, we talk about computation, artificial intelligence, etc. And on the financial side, we talk about how financing is being done, what kind of innovations are taking place. This again does not, it is not a universal thing. It changes according to continents, countries, specific situations, and the different social structures. That's why I think it would be important to hear from you, because this meeting is held mostly virtually, and as to how you look at emerging financial models and technologies. What do you mean for sustainability at the local level? So I have, now 5 speakers. First is the Dean, Faculty of Economics at Khatib University of Kabul, Mr. Najibullah Arshad. If Mr. Arshad there?
I don't think so.
Is it there? No?
No.
Okay. Then may I then take the liberty of requesting Annalisa Boni, who is the Secretary General of Eurocities since June 2014, and she's also Deputy Mayor of Bologna, dealing with ecological transition and international relations. So Annalisa Boni, the word is yours. Yeah, if you can limit yourself to 5 to 7 minutes, that would be useful. Thanks.
How much did you say? Hello? 7 minutes.
7 minutes possible? 7?
Okay. All right. I'll do my best.
Sorry. Yeah.
Good night, everyone, because here it's quite late in Bologna. I just put to bed my girl. But no, I'm joking. So happy to meet you, even if just virtually. So let me just take an experience we are developing and pushing in Europe on how to face the climate crisis, and in a way also how finance comes into the picture. So in the EU, basically, to respond to the climate crisis, there has been an activity, an action, a so-called mission, like the moonshot, at the time, something that would be completely catalyzing all efforts from everywhere, from society, from university research, from economics, from finance as well, to go towards the achievement of one specific objective, which is climate neutrality by 2030. So because cities produce the majority of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they are growing fast, and in Europe, it is estimated by 2050 almost 85% of Europeans will be living in cities. It's really clear that the climate emergency must be tackled by cities and in cities. So this mission is really about pushing and supporting and promoting 100 European cities in their systemic transformation to climate neutrality by 2030, and making these cities innovation hubs for other cities that can follow as well. And it's not just a project, it's really more about like a mission, really like an ambitious endeavor where cities really commit to transformation and engage in it for the benefit of all Europe. So this type of mission requires a new model of city governance. I don't dwell on it because we don't have enough time, but the idea is really to move away from the silos-based form of governance, design and develop for traditional city operations and services, and really moving to a systemic way of working inside administrations in the city as stakeholders. So a holistic approach to innovation and deployment, multi-level governance, so from all, from even international level, I would say, but in this case, European, national, regional, local governance level, talking together, and also a continuous and strong collaboration between all stakeholders in the cities and having citizens on board as well. And to do that, the idea is to use a mechanism that is new in a way, which we have called a climate city contract. So as an instrument to deliver basically the climate neutrality by 2030, that would be a sort of pact. We have heard a lot of climate pacts and so on, but it would be more than that, not just a piece of paper where players and partners put their commitments and their, let's say, objective, but also, let's say, something that would be like a path, a journey to 2030. So with processes and ways of also of cooperation between the different types of stakeholders, public, private, and able to deliver a business plan, an investment plan. And that's where finance comes in. So there has to be a new form of funding and financing to deliver the climate, let's say, to face the climate crisis, at least at city level. Because in a way, it's at the moment, the costs, if we can, the Commission I've seen has commissioned an independent analysis from, based on information from cities all over the EU to get an indication of what additional investments are needed, compared to a business as usual sort of roadmap, right? And that would be 10,000 euros per citizen, to reach climate neutrality. And so the analysis includes transportation, heating, buildings, and electricity, and on one side, and on the other side, it also indicates a net positive economic case for society at 26 billion, which would be made of, co-benefits such as air quality, increased physical activity, noise, accidents, and so on. And so let's say the overwhelming part of this funding and investment, which is a lot, if you multiply the 10,000 euros per citizens by, all the inhabitants of these 100 cities, for instance, the overwhelming part of this funding and investment will have to come from private asset holders, an array of investors, from commercial banks to private equity funds and institutional holdings, and from public sector sources, as I said, at all levels, the local, the regional, the national level, and also European. So the point now is that the current system for the funding and financing of climate innovation and investment in cities is very fragmented. And so this mission wants to also help developing a new approach with appropriate instruments for a sort of coordinated stream of public and private funding for innovation and infrastructures, which, would really be needed to facilitate the systemic transformation that is needed for climate neutrality. And that's why, at the European level, but you can think also in other countries level, in other continents level, it's really important to have a coordinated approach and creating synergies among the different funding programs and, trying to really make an intelligent system out of all the funding that are public fundings that go from the European to the local. And then on top of public investments, a strong effort should be done to find business models for key sectors that need to be transformed to become climate neutral. And also, of course, to achieve the decarbonization goal, this mission has to foster a change in the market structure via multi-level policy innovation. And the investment needed for achieving climate neutrality by 2030 will, of course, be different between member states, between cities, because of national and local circumstances, including, what has already been achieved, so the starting point, but also what will be defined in this, let's say, journey, as I said before, which will be the journey launched by the Climate City contracts, as I said. And also, investment will also depend on how we use and how efficiently we use the allocated resources. But okay, the Climate City contract is there as well as an instrument also to say this is the realistic strategic planning of a city, an analysis of the business as usual scenarios that would be there, with how do you say, a complementary economic appraisal to ensure that any financial support is well invested and efficiently planned throughout the whole, let's say, timeline, and the life of the life of the contract. So yeah, that's the idea. So to start with this climate city contract, have a clear way of catalyzing all, let's say, present investment, let's call them low-hanging fruits, for instance, at the beginning, and then additional ones which could also unlock economically unattractive measures with a a larger portfolio with deeper impacts. Yeah, so it's really about creating an effect that is positive for the city, and with this, let's say, climate city contract and having 100 cities across Europe, it's also interesting to create a sort of critical mass in terms of changing the market, working with financial institutions that can see an interest in all that, like imagine the EIB, the European Investment Banks, or other banks, foundations, private enterprises that work in the energy sector, but also other types of enterprises that want to invest. And of course, if you have 100 cities with a label, it's like a guarantee that these cities will be, investing also in terms of public money in this transition. So it was just an example of what we do, what we are really pushing for in Europe, and we hope to have a sort of impact in the coming years in terms also of how we fund and how we finance the climate crisis at the city level.
Thank you so much. So you are CCC, Climate City Conference.
Yes.
That means all for the 100 cities, yeah? Linked to 100
Yeah.
cities. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. We may come back to it later. So I think it's very useful what you're saying, to bring down the silos and work across the systemic approach. At times,
Yes.
easier said than done. We need to come back to it. How do we really do that? Yeah. So then we have now Christina. Christina Øgaard is a Nordic banking sustainability lead in Accenture Nordic in Denmark. Sustainability and sustainable finance strategies. She has been, focusing on delivering green solutions, sustainable progress, and positive impact. Vashagu, Christina Øgaard.
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting this great event. As you mentioned, my name is Christina Øgaard. I'm head of Nordic Banking Sustainability in Accenture. And I thought I'd bring a little bit of news on new financial models that are springing up in connection with banks and the conventional banking system. And I'll use the Nordics as an example. I think the Nordics are quite progressive, but of course there are other countries globally who are adopting the same approach, and hopefully it will spread. So I bring some good news and some things to be aware of from the banking sector. But as Annalisa mentioned, private finance will be necessary for a good urban transition, and the banks are a key player in that. And I'll be speaking to the bank lending today, so how they lend money. The good news is that in the Nordics, the combination of ambitious policies, regulations, but also consumer and employee and investor pressure is creating a quite significant sustainability transition and a green transition right now. As an example, both Denmark and Sweden have set as a target to reduce their emissions by 2030 with 70%. Now, what that means is that the entire economies are readapting to this. And with that, the tectonic plates of the financial sector are also shifting. Before, it would be enough for a bank to assess the financial performance of a building or a company that they were going to lend to. But by now, climate performance is very, very important as well. Because if a bank fundamentally lends to a company that is performing poorly from a climate perspective, and that company does not want to or cannot change, then that company risks losing relevance in the Nordics. It risks losing customers, and it risks running out of business, and with that actually not being able to repay their loans to the banks. So climate is becoming a financial parameter for the banks, where they need to be aware of climate alongside other financial parameters. On the upside, the banks have a great opportunity in climate performers and companies and buildings that do really well on the climate sphere. If they have a good growth case, they will get more and more customers, more and more interest, and fundamentally they will constitute a good business for the banks. So beyond the kind of moral ethical imperative of contributing to a sustainability transition, the banks also have a financial imperative, both negative and positive, to get onto the climate transition, as it were, in the Nordics. But also very, very importantly is that the banks then want to support their medium performing customers, the ones that are maybe not doing so well today, in improving their performance. Now, if a company or a building or a project needs to improve their climate performance, it needs capital. And quite some banks in the Nordics are willing to provide that capital, because if they help their customers get greener, the banks at the same time actually also future-proof their business by ensuring that their customers are keeping up with time and not getting left behind the climate transition. So all of this speaks to the logic that banks need to start engaging with the net zero transition today. And what we see in the Nordics is that all the largest 7 Nordic banks have already committed to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, where they commit to, first of all, measuring the emissions that they generate via their lending. So looking at their customers, if I lend you €1 million, how much emissions do I contribute to generating? Measuring that across their customer portfolios, and then actually reducing it to a net zero scenario by 2050. And a lot of them are now setting ambitious 2030 targets as well for sector by sector decarbonization. Now, the positive news is that this extends way beyond the Nordics. 117 banks in 41 countries, covering $70 trillion, or about 39% of global banking assets. They have also signed up to this Net Zero Banking Alliance, fundamentally committing to reducing their emissions of their lending to net zero by 2050. Now, this by nature, of course, has positive ramifications for urban development. Banks want to increase their lending to green infrastructure, buildings, and businesses, and they will have an interest in also refurbishing buildings to a more climate-friendly state. However, for banks to really get a grip on this, they will need data. They need to measure and understand the emissions that they currently contribute to, and also how they can reduce them with time. So I think an important message here is also that banks can be a good partner for cities in establishing a fact base and understanding the current state of emissions in order to be able to set measurable and ambitious targets for how cities should decarbonize. The potentially bad news is that banks may also with time have to let go of certain customers that cannot or will not change and become greener as the world is decarbonizing. And that could potentially affect the most vulnerable inhabitants of cities, the ones that live in apartment buildings that cannot afford to refurbish them and make them more climate friendly, or inhabitants working for companies who cannot or will not decarbonize, that are dependent on, overly dependent on fossil fuels or situations like that. And so I think this is also a message that some notable banks, especially in the Nordics, are very acutely aware of the just transition and the need to balance out the kind of desperate need for climate performance improvement alongside social justice and social inclusion. We call it the just transition, right? But some banks have not yet put sufficient focus on this. And so I think it's important that there is a focus on political, regulatory, tactical solutions to ensure that banks prioritize a just transition, not just net zero in isolation. So in summary, I'd like to emphasize 3 takeaways. First, I think that the banks can be valuable partners in identifying and mapping out data on the climate performance of a city and understanding the footprint, the baseline of the footprint of a city. Second is that banks have a bigger impetus now than ever to support the green transition by lending to green companies, and also lending and buildings, and also lending to buildings and companies that want to become greener. And the last one, the third one, is that as the green transition gathers momentum in the financial markets, it's increasingly important to ensure political and regulatory measures to ensure that nobody is left behind and that we achieve a truly just transition. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina. I think we'll come back later about practical examples that we would like to know about. But in the meantime, let me request Laura Marano to provide her view on things. She was awarded the University of Oslo Best Master's Thesis in 2002 this year on the interdisciplinary theme of sustainability. She had worked for a long time as a researcher in Nairobi in informal settlements, and her background is in international development. And of course, she has a vast experience from the continents of Europe, Africa, not least from Kenya, Ethiopia, Norway, and England. So may I request Laura to provide your inputs.
Wow, thank you. So great to hear from someone based in the Nordics and a fellow Italian in Bologna. This is a perfect cocktail. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a little presentation because if not, I will not stick to time. And so how do I do that? I go to share. Share screen. And I will share this. Okay, and I will go to, sorry, I have a very ancient device, so it's a bit slow. Okay, do you see my presentation?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm fresh out of my master's at the University of Oslo. Awesome to get recognized for that. But I have been working for a nonprofit here in Oslo called Tøyen Unlimited. And we've used a model of sort of social enterprise support connected to the public sector. And so what I'll do is I'll just like make a case for why we think knowledge democracy is important in how we work. And then I'll talk a bit about our model here at Tøyen Unlimited, which is now being replicated in other parts of the country. So we have an umbrella sort of social franchise called Norway Unlimited. And then I'll just talk a bit about the tool that we developed with Accenture here in Norway, which has received a design award for its sort of service design and the fact that it happened really quickly. We developed it quite quickly and it's totally free. Unfortunately, it's in Norwegian, only Norwegian at the moment, but I'll just talk a bit about how it works. So scaling impact from the neighborhood up. Yes, knowledge democracy. Why does it matter? So we've heard a lot about the sort of, from the government perspective, the banks. There's been some great discussions so far in the conference about improving sort of private sector investors' confidence in investing in things that are considered quite risky, very sort of small, local, place-based solutions that are initiated, sort of galvanized by local authorities and municipalities, but then how do they scale? How are they made? We believe the social enterprise model is really helpful. So in terms of the theory, if you look at sort of knowledge and data generation as a sort of commodity, which it is at the moment, especially in the context of the SDGs and the UN Agenda 2030, where everything is goal-oriented, indicators, targets, we can get carried away in IP and big data as the solution, which I'm sure there's obviously it serves its function, but we're really concerned about emphasizing knowledge democracy, because if if information and data is publicly funded, it should be accessible to everyday citizens, and it should be open and accessible. And often the barriers to information is not enough. Getting rid of those barriers isn't enough. It's actually making sense of data and it becoming knowledge. And that's really where the empowerment comes in for the scale that we're working in at a very local neighborhood level.
Laura, I just thought I'd make you aware that we're seeing your notes and your kind of presenter's view.
Oh, that's rubbish.
Just thought you'd like to know.
Yeah, for sure. Then you don't get to see the fancy slides.
We see the slides as well. We just see your kind of presenter view. I think it works fine for us as well. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Oh, now that's all I see. Okay. So I guess the theory, or a lot of the findings in my research, and what sort of practitioners, the kind of the critics of the SDG agenda back into 2015 were saying, is that governance by numbers does place a lot of power on the technocratic process of defining targets and indicators, and prescribing the timescales and what people should measure can limit the purpose of the SDGs, which was to leave no one behind. That was the core principle. And, you know, so I won't bore you too much. I was just going to talk about two examples of citizen science or citizen data. This is from Kenya. Do you just see yourselves as well? Can you? Oh, okay. So Know Your City is a big campaign that was run by an international social enterprise or a nonprofit called Slum Dwellers International. And they just use a model that is very much about data collection, savings groups, micro-lending, that emerged from practices in India from the 80s, and now it's global, and they organize as federations. So in Kenya, the Kenyan Federation, that's part of SDI, is the social movement that I studied in my thesis. And the main findings kind of show that obviously there's power in numbers, very much for invisible communities such as informal settlements, but more so that identity is not static. It's a relational issue. So identifying who the local community is and defining, you know, areas that need intervention should be constantly challenged, because the population changes so quickly, and the sort of the question of land is always an issue, and the land regulation is always in favor of the landowners. So tenants living in informal settlements have to find new ways of constantly redefining their interests and so on. But the power of numbers is really what's really influential in the case study that I looked at, which was Mukuru. It's an informal settlement in the industrial area of Kenya, of Nairobi, the capital, and therefore sits on private land and obviously very lucrative. And it's 300,000 people that live in a very small area. So it's quite impressive, and they documented everything, household level data, and they did it by involving the local residents, and obviously international research funding, which is more patient and long-term, in contrast to development and funding. And it was very much led by the government and so on, but I'm not going to bore you with the details of that. It was just to show you an example of citizen-led science. And then the other example is actually EU funding, Horizon 2020, that is being managed by one of our academic partners called Oslo Met. It's the kind of Metropolitan University of Oslo. And the things that they identified for this program is that one of the main challenges in Europe, arguably, is the participation of young people, and they identified these three things as really relevant for involvement in improving engagement with young people: social participation, social belonging, and citizenship rights. So that's very much aligned with this idea of democracy of knowledge, and hones in on what should be measured and by whom. So this is young people collecting data about young people and ways of improving their sense of citizenship and belonging. And it's European wide, and we're very much connected to that as well in our neighborhood of Toyin. So there's some great resources on the websites. So a little bit about Unlimited. We invest in people, and we take that initial leap of faith. We're at the idea stage. We are nested in the neighborhoods of Oslo, which have the highest inequality issues. We've got high child poverty rates in Grønland and Tøyen, which sounds like ridiculous for Norway, with its incredible amount of wealth and strong welfare state and sort of safety nets. But the challenges are big, not as big as in Sweden and Denmark, but there are pockets, and it's like a high contrast of inequality, and it's very hidden. So we take that initial leap of faith. Anyone walks through the door, they have an idea for something they want to do in their local area, we support them. And we do that through the Unlimited UK model. So we offer these 3 packages of support, and we have a støttespiller, someone to sort of be their kind of support person with experience of running their own social enterprise, to just develop the idea, try it. We give 10,000 kroner, so £1,000. Euros. I don't remember the exchange rates anymore. But yeah, it's not a lot of money, but it's a community and a place to actually say, look, we see you and your value, and let's figure out what other assets you have. And then the Do It package is 10,000 kroners. No, 50,000. That's 5,000 euros. And then Build It is possibly like their first sort of social procurement contract, big clients, and maybe they've already been through an accelerated program. But we're place-based, so we're very much about the location, and we're connected to the local authority, any volunteer center, community center, that kind of thing, because it's important to be visible and to use the assets that are already there. And although we're initially funded by area boost programs, where like the city council, the municipality put extra money into neighborhoods that have got social challenges, these programs last about 5 years. We set up a community incubator, and we're still there once the Områdeløft, the community boost program, is finished. So this is a continuation of resources. So that's the place-based. Space is very important as well, and using the buildings that are currently there. And a lot of them are very run down. In fact, our first community incubator was set up about 7 years ago, and we just put stickers on the window of an old local authority building that wasn't being used. And people didn't take notice of us for 2 years, so we did what we wanted to do. And then once they realized how well we were doing, they started giving us some money. So here we are, the final thing, which was about partnerships and how important that has been. And our partnership with Accenture Norway took about 2 years to really materialize. But when it did, we were able to deliver a digital solution for content that we had developed here. I specifically, for about 5 years, working with the social entrepreneurs, activists, community members that we've supported. We basically support about 10 new unlimited, as we call them, social entrepreneurs every year, and about 25 actively every year. So in total for 7 years, there's been many. And there are 3 similar unlimited organizations in Norway. There's one in Stavanger and 2 other in the city of Oslo. So Accenture, they set up a team as part of their CSR, part of their sustainability strategy, to work with us. And we developed a digital tool called Viste, which means show it. So it's an impact measurement tool, and it's very accessible. The whole point was to be open source, really simple, and anyone can do it. Which is really challenging with a digital tool, because like already it's online and not everyone can do it. You know? So there's something about the design of the technology, making sure it's like usable on a phone, and you don't have to store data and all that. So it won a design award, which is saying quite a lot, because there's a lot of great design solutions in Norway. There's a lot of funding for things like that. And the idea is we basically think the practice of good impact reporting and identifying sort of real talent starts from democratizing the practice. So those closest to the social issues are those best placed to solve them, or at least define them. So we try and embed sort of data collection and social impact measurement really early on. this is what it looks like, more or less. It's 3 stages. And we've been working with one of the largest impact investors in Norway since the beginning of this. We set up an ecosystem sort of network of social enterprise support organizations, from like the Crown Prince's Fund to FAD, connected with the biggest players that are already committed to social impact measurement. And this is it. Yeah, basically check it out. It's free for everyone to use. And just to finalize, yeah, we're very conscious of the fact that measurement is never an innocent matter of where facts speak for themselves. I think that's important to remember. And we try to keep that in mind.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks, Laura. As I say, you know, what's not counted can be measured, or what's measured is not counted.
Yeah.
So, I think we have around 3 different perspectives presented today at this session. We heard about the European cities program on climate performance. It's a transition with sustainability. Then we talked about how banks are changing the ways in which they do the lending, where green lending or sustainable financing becomes an important aspect. Then we had the presentation on how it actually, you know, boils down to local communities. How do they access financing for their project, kind of thing. So, I mean, I'm just wondering. I would take just like three of you. So, if you have any questions for each other, would you like to present any sort of? You've heard the 3 presentations yourselves. So, I would like to find out if you have any comments on the presentations made earlier. Who would like to go first? Annalisa, do you have any questions on the presentations?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to Christina, because it's the, you know, it's the part that is the most difficult for us, in terms of also how to deal with banks and the, you know, the different system and, you know, how it works. I mean, for us, it's very sort of easy to go on the classical European bank, which is the EIB, because it's structured, it's well, in a way, it's well integrated with the, you know, funding that we get as well. It's got the same sort of priorities as you can imagine. So, you know, it's the same language. But at the same time, it also requests, you know, high risks, you know, big projects and so on. So it's also not always easy to use for everyone. And on the other side, the rest of the financing world is even more difficult to understand. I mean, I'm talking about lots of cities, not only the big ones, which have, you know, more capacity and stuff to understand and to deal with that, but more generally, it's like, you know, you need intermediaries, you need to, you know, it's like, how would you help municipalities to understand how they can work with you and how, you know, it can work out, basically.
Christina?
Yeah, great question, Annalisa. Thank you for that. I think it really depends on geographies, right? So I see what one of the models that we have in Denmark is that you have coordinated municipal funding, right? So the different municipalities, they work together and have a common interface towards the banks where they ask for funding together. I think that's quite effective. So these kind of financial collaborations, because then you can afford to hire the expertise to actually have the dialogue with the bank on the bank's terms. I know that's not a super useful answer, but I think, to be fair, like, finance has, for better or worse, become really complicated, and it's not as intuitive as it could have been, particularly not when you get to a municipal level or a larger corporate level. You need actually experts to be able to handle it. And so collectivizing the lending, I think, is one solution. The other, I think, is that what you see beyond the kind of sustainable financing, which I've been speaking to, which works actually by a financial imperative, like you want to avoid losses by betting or lending to the blockbusters of the climate transition, and you want to support the ones who will drive the climate transition. Beyond that, I think a lot of banks speaking for the Nordics again, have some quite well developed social responsibility and corporate social responsibility programs. So I think that by identifying the right stakeholders in a bank, you could probably get a good dialogue on how municipalities and banks can work together. Like one case is on like the mapping out the data. I noticed your quotes, Laura, which are very meaningful on like governance by numbers leverages the power of authority and so on. But still, I think, you know, like municipalities and banks have a common interest in understanding where are we starting from and where do we need to go. And with that also then developing models for measuring and for being sure that the efforts you make are creating an impact, right? So I think there are various avenues into a bank beyond the advisor that you deal with as a customer for a municipality and for a city.
So
I hope that answers part of your question.
Can I just complement with another small question, if it's possible, if we have time?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, thank you. There's also, I mean, the idea is also to move to innovative instruments, yeah, of finance.
That's what I want to discuss also, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, because like, for instance, I don't know if you have a fund in a city that you manage to create with one private partner, for instance, then how do you make sure that this fund can help you attract new financial partnerships?
So I think this is one of the most interesting developments I've seen in a long time. So basically, there has been some innovation in this realm, and I'll just mention a notable example, which was between Danske Bank and SIDA, the Swedish Development Organization. So not a municipality as such, but the model lends itself to various entities. And so fundamentally, SIDA wanted to attract capital. And there is a very large and growing demand from investors to actually be able to invest in social efforts and social impact projects. But often the investors want to invest a larger chunk of money. And there are very many small and scattered social impact projects that fundamentally become a bit too small for larger investors to go into them, right? So what SIDA did was to gather a portfolio of projects with a certain kind of social focus, so like enabling women and small and medium-sized enterprises and so on. And together with Danske Bank, they issued a bond that was for, I believe, 2 billion Swedish kroner. And so that bond attracted then investors that had larger chunks of money, but still was effective on smaller projects. And SIDA got access to all of this capital. What they had to do, though, was guarantee for the risk. So if these projects went really poorly, SIDA would have to cover the financial downside. But that is a very, very small amount comparing to themselves generating 2 billion Swedish kroner to fund all of these projects. So I think some call them a social impact bond. I think there are various terms for it. But this notion of working together with the larger banks to pool up these smaller social projects and structuring them, and then opening that as a bond for investors that are quite hungry to invest in this. So it's like a public issue, public-private partnership, if you will, in the funding model. In the interest of time, I'll stop it here, but I see this as a very elegant way for the public domain to attract capital. Because instead of pulling it all out of your own pocket, you issue it to investors, you guarantee for the downside risk, because you'd need to do that for a lot of them to be interested. But fundamentally, you can attract a lot of capital like that. And I think we'll see more of that going forward.
Thank you. So of course, what we're talking about is also kind of a scale, you know. Laura's presentation was about scale on the basis of community level, you know, entrepreneurship and generating, you know, income and investment on that side. While climate financing, the investments of European Bank, Development Bank, or you know, Nordic Bank or whatever they are sort of a, you know, larger financing investment initiatives. So the point is that don't we see a linkage between these two, in the sense that We don't want, I mean, people have, I mean, some people say CSR is not really that much amount compared to how much money the companies are making anyway. CSR may be 5%, 10%, 2% of the profit goes in CSR, whereas the major profit, is for shareholders or whatever it is. So what I'm asking here is that, to what extent you see a linkage between the large-scale infrastructure investment to mitigate climate change, transition from environmentally polluting to more sustainable industries. Well, that goes on at a macro level, country level, city level. At the community level, also there is a kind of a need for increasing financing and investment, in the sense that there are always losers and winners in the climate thing. There's a number of people with jobless in many ways, for example, or a number of people may have to get new training for new jobs. So these don't happen at a large scale that people have to find this is for themselves. So what is your take on it, Laura? How do you look at linkage between the sort of bigger scale and the scale that you're talking about?
Yeah, thank you. Well, big question. I guess scale is not necessarily just quantitative, isn't it? It's also like qualitative scaling, which is about behavioral change and attitude. And I guess there is the pragmatic kind of number counting, geographic scale and numbers and scaling out and in and all of that and deep. But there's also this scaling in terms of we've never been faced with this challenge before, and that business as usual just doesn't work. And we have to take a leap of faith and be bold enough to invest in things that have not been tried. So there's an element of people's behavior changing, and that has to happen from within the public sector. In Nairobi, the case study I looked at, it was about changing very colonial, old kind of measurements and standards of the width of roads and how drain pipes should be built. And that needed to be renegotiated because urban planners were trained for cities that don't exist anymore. The challenges are different. In the work we do with social entrepreneurs, it's really hard to evidence what works because the public sector, nonprofits have never been challenged to sort of actually document. They've just been challenged to count. How many people attended? Where did you spend the money? If it's 100,000 here, 500,000 there, the requirements for measurement are just like outputs. They're not outcome measures. The kind of the skill level, the insight of measuring outcomes has become something that you hire someone to do SROI for you. It's just like a small organizations won't do that. They don't even know to ask those questions. But what's exciting is these impact investors and these boards that are really really committed to investing in this sort of just transition. So I guess in a way, I'm going to answer with a question, which is to say, ESG, the kind of challenge to the corporate sector of measuring risk and quantifying value and opportunities in future sort of modeling and transitions have to account for the externalities of like governance and social measures too. And I wonder if that's kind of also in the banking sector, or am I just, a lovely optimist in my little academic local community bubble? Because I think that could make a difference to scale.
So Lara, just to understand your question, it's whether banks are aware of the kind of social and governance issues as well?
Is that as valuable? Because it's always because I think the green agenda is so much stronger than the kind of red or brown, the other colors.
So I think it depends on geographies, and it depends on the profile of the bank. So we find that co-op banks that are owned by their customers tend to be more socially oriented. Mm-hmm. I think what has really ignited the banks on the climate agenda is partly that the world is changing around them and they need to adapt, but partly also that climate is relatively easy to measure. And even though we've been speaking about, measurements, that is fundamentally what banks do as their métier. right?
Right.
So that's their comfort zone. And with CO2, you can measure and manage it, much like money. So it's a new field, but as soon as you have the data in-house, it's much the same processes and much the same mechanisms you can deal with them by, which means that for banks, it's relatively easy.
Yeah.
It's actually super complex, but relatively easy as compared to social measures to integrate it. What we see is that some banks would like to start tackling it, but it's quite difficult to do at scale. So back to the comment earlier by our moderator that you have a CSR budget, which is a relatively small tranche of your turnover. But then if you start integrating sustainability into the way you work with your lending, then fundamentally the sky is the limit, right? Many banks have billions and billions of green lending generating positive impact every year now, which is completely outside their CSR budget. It's just about them reorienting their business models to more sustainability. The challenge when you work with social measures is that it's quite difficult for a bank to individually assess all their customers. It's going to become subjective. You need some kind of formulaic approach to it that ensures also equal treatment of all the customers, right, and equal assessment. And so you get to a point where you would need some kind of quantitative measures as a bank to manage it at scale with, you know, many thousands, not to say millions of customers that you need to work with, right? And so just as an example, the EU has created this taxonomy for the financial markets, which defines what is sustainable. And they've already published that for climate. They've launched a working group on defining how can we measure and manage social efforts as part of this. But it's proven extremely complicated to pan out even like an objective approach to what constitutes social and not. I was part of a working group on that, super interesting discussions, but just very hard to make it practicable for a bank that needs to ensure equal treatment of customers, but also to be relatively certain of what they're doing and remove the subjectivity of an advisor, right? In the investment space, it's slightly different. You can find impact in investors who have the time and effort to look into individual investments, right? But for lending, if you want to scale it and achieve real impact, we still have a way to go on agreeing what constitutes social, what are the parameters, and also to avoid social washing from the banks, right? Unless you have a commonly agreed standard, you risk some banks just claiming that they are social. Not a lot, but a few may claim that they are doing social, social lending without really having that covered. So that was a long answer.
Right.
It's more to say a lot of banks really want to do this, but they haven't found a good way of scaling it yet. But certainly they have come further on the climate agenda and are more comfortable with the kind of parameters of the climate agenda to work further with that. But yeah, a lot of banks want to integrate social parameters, especially in connection with the green transition, to ensure that it becomes a just transition.
So in that, while the grand scheme of tackling climate change, cities at the forefront of doing things in Europe, at times externalities may put brakes into that plans. Yeah, like for example, many cities in Europe are now trying to go back to producing electricity from coal. Many cities want to sort of use more oil. So, I mean, how does it actually, these are situations that one has not been prepared for. So, however grand design one may have, the externalities sometimes sort of, hinder the ideas of sustainability. What's your take on it, Annalisa?
Well, it's externalities, but at the end of the day, it's also wrong choices by national governments, if I may say so. Because a city could, I've rarely seen a city taking the decision of opening, a coal site. So it's really about, I mean, I'm talking now for my own government, both, the one that is still in government, but will go, and the new one. I mean, if the government had taken the right decisions already 10 years ago, we wouldn't be in this situation in terms of investing in, renewable energy and so on. So of course, when you go back to a situation where you have to find solutions to huge problems because you haven't done the work before, then everyone pays the price for it. But the choices, the point is cities are trying to be resilient and trying to move within the limits and competences, actually push the national government, the regional governments to take more daring, let's say, choices, choices that would not make people happy or economic interests happy sometimes, and so on. So I think we just have to, like, for the moment, we need, that's why having conversations, maybe even difficult conversations with banks, with the private sector, who want to move away from those, in a way, wrong choices, is the way forward. And sometimes we find ourselves to say, okay, the government goes the wrong way, we try and go the other way and try our best to do it. But then, okay, we need to have the right legal competence. I think regulatory is very important, and so on. So it's a continuous fight in this respect. But that's why I was mentioning the Climate City Contract as a way also to align a multi-level governance and make it more coherent in the achievement of a common objective from, for the country, but down to the single citizen. So I hope this will be the case, at least in Italy, but the Northerns are much better in this.
Thank you. Thanks for this. I just wanted to sort of, we don't have much time. I just wanted to ask Laura a question. Since you've worked in Africa a lot, are there lessons that Europe can learn from the finance? Even though you talk about, Africa as a kind of a case that needs always support and sustainability from NORAD or SIDA or DANIDA. What lessons eventually, when it comes to sustainable finance, sustainable living, one can learn from the countries that you work in, for example?
I'm muted. So in a nutshell, no, obviously, I think the sort of normative agenda of UN Agenda 2030 and in the AU 2063, I think, has helped open some doors for social movements, civil society organizations, advocacy organizations that try to use the legal tools available to them in their cities and countries. Because of this call for leaving no one behind, and then the universality of the goals and the need for data, and actually formal systems of housing provision, basic amenities, water, electricity, sewage, the government just is not in a position to can't afford or deal with the scale of demand. So in large cities like Nairobi or Addis Ababa, so actually the informal, this kind of old dichotomy, thanks to the Brits, is actually a kind of a false narrative, because the informal is the formal. Over 68% of citizens in Nairobi live in informal settlements. They don't want to own a house. They don't need a mortgage. They're probably going to rent for at least 20 years of their lives, and they want jobs. That's why they're in the cities, and they want mobility, and they want access to education, and they just want dignity of living conditions. And so what's really impressive is the scale. So if we're talking about scale and numbers, the examples coming out from cities like Nairobi, like Addis Ababa, some incredible research coming out of Indian cities, how they use sort of GIS and all sorts of technology to kind of map the weather patterns and pollution levels and just everything like that, that's accessible at a really local level, and that's informed by the habits and culture, and it's culturally sensitive as well. Understanding who is it that lives in these buildings, how are they really being included, who's being hurt by these national policies, who's losing out from these city policies that is driving out a certain kind of income generation. Because obviously in slums like Mukuru, or informal settlements like Mukuru, it's 98% of the 300,000 that live there are tenants, and most of them are female-led households. they're very small, and they usually have children, and they're dependent on the informal economy. So actually this process of formalizing and documenting and taxing and everything is also a risk to their livelihood. So it's not everyone's on board, when it comes to working with government and formalizing. But what's really powerful is when these social movements understand the only way change happens is if you work with what you have locally. So the cool thing about the case study in Mukuru was that it was led by local government. So it was patient. It took 7 years to get to where they were, but they worked with the legislative kind of opportunities in Nairobi. They worked with their budgetary cycles. And so then the accountability remains in Nairobi. It isn't funded by CEDA, it isn't funded by UN Habitat, it is run by the local residents, with the local authority taking responsibility.
So endogenous development is quite important.
Yeah, because that's how the financing stays consistent.
So we're coming to the end of this session now. Before I end, I would like the opportunity each of you, sort of 30 seconds, any final words that you have, maximum 1 minute. I can again, I can start with Christina.
Yeah, I think as Laura touched on, partnerships are increasingly important. We all need to work together to succeed with this. And I think that the banks, I'm not working for a bank myself anymore, but I'm advising banks. And what we can see in the Nordics is that the banks are increasingly open for private-public partnerships and for pooling together, both on the financial and financing side, but also from a more corporate social responsibility perspective, working on local community development and so on. So I think there's a big opportunity to partner together and leverage each other's competencies and strengths to work together for a more sustainable future.
Wonderful. Then may I ask Annalisa now?
Yeah, maybe 1 minute to say that basically what we need is really like innovative governance or change in the paradigm of governance, meant as 360 degrees approach to it, in the sense of governance in urban ecosystems, in terms of how we work with people in urban ecosystems, again in terms of how players and partners and different institutions and types of stakeholders work together. Governance inside institutions, you need to change completely the way you do policies, and this systemic approach completely disrupts years and years and years of work. Governance in terms of, as I said before, multi-level partnership and coherence. Governance in terms of financing as well, so how to improve that, and the dialogue between these two different worlds, the public and the let's say the funding and the financing, and so on. So I think governance can be the sort of investment arena where to put energy.
Thanks for that. Final comment from you, Laura.
Grazie. Tusen tack. That was really exciting. It was. It's not every day you get to have such interesting perspectives in one room. This has been really rewarding, and yeah, I guess I agree with all the two speakers. Yeah, I just think that a lot of it is about behavioral change when it comes to transition, and that happens, internally and within where we live and who we speak to and who we work with. And so, yeah, bottom up.
Thanks for wonderful inputs, inspiring indeed. I'm really learned a lot from this discussion today. I hope that we all benefit from this, and we'll keep in touch with you. Thanks again. Just before I leave, we have a resolution that comes out of Urban Economy Forum 4. I don't know if you received draft resolution. In case you need to have points included, I would very much appreciate your time to provide inputs to the resolution. In case it would be very much useful for us in the final document that we come out of this meeting. Yeah, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Have a nice evening or day.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon or whatever.
For you tonight. Yeah, good night then. Good night.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye. Bye. Bye.